Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being slaughtered like a cow. So a couple of weeks back, I mentioned that we had already set up a backup for Sacred Cow Shipyards at a place called Odyssey. And apparently, y'all are just flush with backups for YouTube these days. It kind of speaks to how YouTube has gone down that whole censorship path pretty heavily recently. And by limited request, I have also set up another backup at a place called Rumble. Wonderfully weird names y'all come up with these days. Anyways, I would like to stress that both are backups. I probably will not be monitoring the comments hardly at all, and all they do is synchronize against whatever YouTube is doing here. Now, if anything were to go to shit here on YouTube, we'd figure out some way to let everyone know which of these two things I'd be using as my primary in the future. But in the meantime, if you want to subscribe to one, the other, both, neither, really doesn't matter to me. And now on with the show. Ever since you squishy humans have figured out how to fly around without flapping your arms like some featherless bird, I am sure Diogenes would be proud of you at this point. You've been wanting to mount aircraft on aircraft. It's basically just a consistent theme for y'all. You have little things dangling underneath blimps. You have small things piggybacking on big things. It's a whole theme. I have no idea. Well, no, I actually do kind of have an idea. Aircraft carriers were very much a new thing when you were still dorking around with the parasite fighter concept initially, and you wanted to be able to get away with doing the whole force projection nonsense from something that was not necessarily an aircraft carrier. Or you wanted to force project over land, especially land that was not typically reachable by the aircraft that typically came off of the typical aircraft carriers of the typical time, as was typical. Or you wanted to ensure that the bombers and transports that you had their escorts with them at all times by literally bolting the escorts to the bombers or transports and then letting them go when the situation called for it. I mean, makes sense, right? I mean, not really, though. I guess in terms of the context, your aircraft at the time had limited fuel and endurance and range, so it made a certain degree of sense, but it was still buck-f***ing nuts. And naturally, as with all crazy ideas, it has somehow saturated your media to the point that it has been infected by it, and has produced such interesting things as, say, this. If there were a correct way to do helicarriers, and I guess we might get there at some point in this episode, this is definitely not that. Now, to be fair, I do not have a significant number of complaints about the superstructure of this particular example from the frankly awesome movie called Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. Yes, the runways do point at the superstructure, which is generally considered to be a bad thing at your point in time and technology, but this particular movie is meant to take place approximately in the diesel punk era, right before the atom punk era. So not being able to stop before you run out of runway and having to take off again wasn't really so much a huge problem, and basically this particular platform solved it by having enormous runways to start with. But the methods that are keeping it aloft? Who the ever-loving fuck came up with that insanity? I mean, I guess I kind of get it, because again, this is taking place during the diesel punk era, where most of your aircraft were propeller-powered, and jets were just starting to be a thing, so there weren't really a whole lot of other options for keeping this massive flying platform aloft, aside from, helicopter blades. The problem is, they took the helicopter blades and they pointed them down. So now you have this massive, and I mean that in like all senses of the word, platform suspended in the sky, balancing on what amounts to be 4 of those big red rubber ball things that I'm told you can hear the sound of them hitting something just by seeing a photo of them. So here you go! You're having this weird dynamic stability problem going on with an aircraft carrier. That's not a sentence you want to be saying. There is, after all, a reason that most of your helicopters have the spinny blades on the top part, because then the rest of the aircraft just kind of dangles underneath that, and that's all just fine. Now, I technically get that this is an aircraft carrier, and you can't have spinny blades of fucking death immediately above the flight deck where aircraft are landing and taking off from. Fine. But it would really, really suck to be on approach for this thing and have some sort of catastrophic failure, and still end up in the fucking spinny blades of fucking death after all, regardless. Which, of course, points out another problem with this entire concept of a quote-unquote helicarrier. Your species has a very quaint saying along the lines of helicopters are 1,000 moving parts spinning around an oil leak. And it is just a saying, but it's not entirely wrong either. I mean, I guess the good news with this particular model is that all the oil is going to leak downwards and not onto the flight deck and not further f*** up flight operations. There's that, right? But the real problem is what happens when one of those helicopter assemblies, fails. Which, of course, brings us to the helicarrier example that you are probably most familiar with in your current timeline. And that is to say, the one from the Avengers Marvel Universe movie series blah 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 whatever. And really, I don't even know where to start with these things. I mean, I guess first off, the important thing is that there's basically 2 generations in the MCU for the helicarriers. There's the one that successfully, or at least briefly, captured Loki, and then there are the 3 Insight helicarriers, and those are 2 different models of the same basic idea. But we're going to start with the first one, and I just want to say, what the fuck? Why in the fuck are they steaming it through the ocean? I mean, I feel certain that I have said this before, but I'm going to say it again just for good measure. Salt water is terrifying. Salt water hates metal. Salt water hates moving things. Salt water especially hates moving metal things. Salt water hates you. Salt water hates everything that isn't salt water. Salt water is condensed liquid hate. And guess what a helicopter is? Guess what the blades are that keep this helicarrier afloat? They're metal moving things that are not made out of salt water. And you stuck them into salt water. And then you tried to run them in salt water. Who the fuck came up with this idea? Good grief. I mean, I guess the good news of the helicarrier is it does actually have 2 flight decks, and one of them is actually angled appropriately. And by the way, that whole angled thing is to allow what the helicarrier actually does, and that's recover and launch aircraft simultaneously. Only with your current modern aircraft carriers, the recovery deck and the launch deck are on the same level, whereas with the helicarrier, the recovery deck is above the launch deck and can actually serve as a launch deck in and of its own right, which is also true on a normal aircraft carrier. So at least they thought about that. But still, helicopter blades in the water. I mean, your current helicopters do not appreciate operating in a salt spray environment, much less an actual salt water environment. And it's designed to do that. You can't lubricate it enough for it to work right. And that is fundamentally part of the problem. This was never going to work. I mean, at least the helicarrier from the MCU solved the problem of not putting the rotor blades beneath the aircraft. This time they're just level with the aircraft. And oh, by the way, that recovery deck, if you don't make the landing, you might get sucked into one of the blades. So sorry about that. Now, thankfully, the helicarriers did get upgraded with Tony Stark's repulsor technology, and once you get into that magic box, I guess any kind of flying vehicle could work in the end. But the real problem is what happens in the movie where they capture Loki, and they lose not 1, but 2 of those turbines, keeping the helicarrier afloat. Yeah, that shit don't fly, man. Literally. Now, to their credit, when the second engine finally went down, the helicarrier did finally start falling out of the sky. But no. It would have fallen when the first engine went down, and that's the problem with the entire concept of helicarriers. You see, you're basically making a table in the sky, for lack of a better analogy. You've got thrusters in 4 corners, holding up a box-ish shape that is very, very heavy. And those 4 thrusters are each pushing up with equal amounts of force, give or take a certain delta, and they help probably move it forwards and backwards and sideways too. The problem is, if any one of those 4 thrusters were to fail, the other 3 would have to do some really complicated force vectoring to even begin balancing the table again. And they can't. They basically can't. I mean, the problem isn't really a question of thrust. I have absolutely no idea that these engines were over-engineered by at least 50%, and that is to say that basically their cruising output is about 2/3 of their maximal output. So if they came to it, yes, the 3 engines would be able to match the total thrust output of all 4 engines. The problem is the 3 engines are making a triangle that is trying to support a square, and the triangle only covers half of the square. And yeah, you could totally try. You could totally angle the engines in a way that would try to accommodate the missing engine and again do that really complicated vector addition. But I somehow doubt the helicarrier will appreciate being turned into this massive cantilever in the process. And then when the second engine goes down, possibly on the same side, possibly not, the movie's kind of vague and unclear about that specific detail, yeah, the helicarrier would have simply fallen out of the sky at that point. There is no conceivable reason for them to have engineered the engines to have 100% overcapacity, and if both engines on the same side failed, there is no possible way the engines on the opposite side could have kept the helicarrier aloft. It just would have fallen like a rock, and if the engines were trying to keep it aloft, it would have fallen like a rock in this massive, horrific spiral fashion that would have, like, plastered everyone against every conceivable bulkhead and thrown everything over the side. I mean, if nothing else, go get one of those cheap little quadcopter drone thingies that your children play with and, unplug one of the rotors and see what happens. And then unplug 2 of the rotors and see what happens. It ain't gonna work, man. Now, if you want to build a helicarrier with, say, like 8 engines arrayed around the circumference to keep it aloft and over-engineer them significantly, then yeah, you would have enough redundancy that I could start believing that a helicarrier might possibly maybe work. But until you do that, there is no conceivable way that any government on your entire planet would sign off on this massive flying aircraft carrier that could land on a civilian population at any given moment. I mean, y'all would be basically city destroying yourself. It would be hilarious, but also horrible at the same time, I guess. And then, to make matters worse, along came the insight carriers. Oh my god. So first off, they have these intelligent gun systems attached to the bottom of them that have, like, no barrel, and yet are somehow capable of hitting a target miles away. Yeah, sure. Maybe these rocket-propelled guided rounds? I don't know. Possibly. Could be. Whatever. And then, they decide to mount battleship guns on top and underneath these helicarriers. Because everybody loves battleship guns, right? Right? Well, that actually is kind of true. The problem is, it's actually mythical that when your United States old Iowa-class battleships lit off a full broadside, that they would scoot sideways in the water. That doesn't actually happen. There's actually an interesting webpage that documents exactly why that doesn't happen. Mostly because water's non-compressible. Guess what air is? Very, very compressible. So yeah, setting off those cannons while you're flying above the surface of the planet, that's going to have a noticeable effect on your flight profile, like significantly. I mean, it's not exactly going to knock you out of the sky, but it's not something you want to do very often. And then those, like, thousands of guns underneath the bottom of it, that's also going to be a problem. And that's without even talking about the massive glass dome on the bottom of the helicarrier that controls apparently the brain for their entire interconnected network system. Why is it on the bottom of the helicarrier? Why is it in a massive glass dome? What the f*** were you guys smoking? I mean, holy hell, in the end, Dr. Banner's initial concern about the helicarrier, that it was meant to be a submarine as opposed to a flying vehicle, is actually where they should have taken the notion, because your species has actually experimented with submersible aircraft carriers before, and they worked better than this nightmare contraption. The footnote is that they didn't actually work that well, but they still work better than this thing! And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.